even if I touch a meal. And do it through the pain, I don't need the pain. And life gon' get me down, but it won't break my will. Cause I've been chasing this so long, I can't give up. I won't give in, been through too much. I done prayed for the money, I done prayed for the fame. I done prayed that I will make a sacrifice and play this game. I done prayed that my life would never be the same. I done prayed that I will make it bring glory to my name.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Uncle Strib. Today, just want to go ahead and start the podcast off with this. This podcast is brought to you by Final Form Supplements. Here I'm excited because we just got in our creatine monohydrates, 100% pure creatine. For those of y'all that don't really know what creatine is a supplement your body, it's naturally found in the body, and we primarily get our creatine through eating red meat and salmon and things like those. So it's not a foreign substance. A lot of people think of it as a drug, but it is found naturally within the body. Taking creatine is really good for increasing lean muscle mass, losing fat, increasing performance in the weight room, and helping with recovery. So you're able to go hard day in and day out, and it will help recover and reduce soreness or severity of soreness. I take creatine every day. You mix it with whatever water, juice, Gatorade, whatever you want to mix it with, one time a day. Doesn't matter when you take it. As long as you take it every day consistently, you're good. Creatine's fantastic. I believe everybody that is able should be on creatine, and it's a has great cognitive benefits with focus, mood, and clarity and clear thinking. So again, creatine monohydrate. We're selling locally here at San Antonio at 8058 Venice Drive, San Antonio, Texas 78320. Or you can go onto our website, finalformsubs.com. Subs is SUPPS. Finalformsubs.com. Use promo code Strib, all caps, no space, get 10% off your entire order. And you can also check out the other things we got going on there. Creatine monohydrate, Final Form supplements. Achieve your final form. Now that is out the way, we're getting straight to this podcast. So this one, again, is another fan-submitted question. And it is, should all schools be private schools? Or should all schools be private in terms of the public schooling system? And to give my short answer, no. I think that's a terrible idea, and I'm gonna go over why in a few points. But I myself came from I'm a product of public schools. I grew up from my first official day in school to graduating high school was public school all the way through. So I have a few experiences in public schools, and public schools are rough. I have experience. I've never been to a private school, but I have experiences with people in private schools, if that makes sense. The culture is just different. Public schools, I believe it's a lot more is going on. It's a lot more hectic. I feel like, people know bullying is probably a little more prevalent. And it's just a lot of stuff going on because you generally have a more diverse group of people in public schools than private school. But just getting straight into why I think this is a bad idea or why I disagree with this statement is, one, not everybody can afford private schools. Because the reason private schools are private is because they're funded privately. Public schools are paid by the state, and sometimes federal, but they're paid by the government. Usually the state government pays for these public schools. Public schools are free. You do have to pay, like, I think lunch at my school was like $2.50 a day, something like that or whatever. Or you could just take your own lunch. But there's what you can go to public school for free if you cannot afford things like that, like what lunch. But you can go to a public school. It is free, and school is mandatory, which is another point I'm going to get to later. But you have to have some type of schooling until you're 18. Then you can drop out, get your GED, and leave, whatever you want to do. But schooling is mandatory. So if you don't go to private school, don't go to public school, you can get homeschooled. And homeschooled as an option and it's also something I'm going to talk about later. But homeschooling has pros and cons to itself because you have to have somebody that is quote unquote certified to teach your child. So if you or yourself are not able to teach your child what they should be learning in high school, or don't have the time or the accreditation to, you have to hire somebody to teach your kid. Or there's sometimes they have homeschooled like classes where it's a bunch of different homeschooled people that go to a person that teaches homeschool students. So, quote unquote home school not necessarily mean that the person is learning at home. Some people do because their parents were teachers, or their parents are able to have the time and the ability to educate them themselves. But most of the time, they're homeschooled. They're teaching from somebody else that's usually a former teacher and things like that. But not everybody can afford private school. So I just looked up the state of Texas just because that's where I'm at right now. And the average tuition for elementary school is $10,000 a year for elementary school. For high school, it's $11.4 thousand a year, and that's per child. And that's where I believe it's going to become a problem, because if you're a family that has 5 kids, you're paying, and they're all elementary school, you're paying $50K a year for them to go to school. And elementary school is 1st through 5th grade for the standard or traditional elementary school. So you're talking 5 years of $50K a year, which is, I believe, $250,000. That's just elementary school. Doesn't include when they go to high school, where it gets more expensive. And if they go to college, you're talking anywhere, depending if they're interstate, out of state, anywhere between $25,000 to $40,000 a year per child. So it's a financial roadblock to make all schools private. Now, you could make the argument that if you make all schools private, obviously there's going to be different levels of private schools. So you can have some private schools that are going to be cheaper, and then some private schools are going to be more expensive. But even if you make it a private school and you charge to go to school, that's still more than free. Even if the tuition was only $1,000 per kid, that's still $1,000 more than if you were going to go to a public school, which is free. And I believe the whole premise of making public school system is free is because if you're going to mandate education, I don't see how you can mandate something like that, something like school education, and then make it mandatory to pay for school. The whole point of having a public school system was to have public access or free access to education for your kids. Anyway, that's just one thing. It's just financially, some people just can't afford to pay $10,000 per kid to send to school. I believe, and think about how that would affect the demographic of the country, for say. Let's just say, for example, let's say they did mandate it, and then you have people like me that don't have kids yet, but now this law's been implemented. And now some people that would want multiple kids, that's going to affect families, or it's going to affect people's decisions on how many kids they want to have. Because if you're going to have to pay $10,000 per kid, then that you're going to have to take that into account, or at least you should take that into account when you're talking about having kids with your significant other or your wife, husband, whatever it is, because that's an expense you're going to have to pay. So I believe I think it's safe to say that the overall amount of people I believe the average family has 3 kids. I believe it's 3 now. 3 kids per family. Let me double check. If I can spell right. Average kids per family. Oh, wow, it actually dropped. Interesting. So it's about 2 kids on average. Only 24% of the country has 3 kids. Anyway, but that percent of people that have 3 kids is probably going to drop. And then I just believe the overall statistics of people having multiple child will probably drop just because of that factor. Next point is, like I had mentioned earlier, public schooling is mandatory. So if you're the government, you're kind of forcing a financial burden onto a family, right? So, you have, especially, let's say you have a family that has 5 kids and they're all in elementary school, like I said. And let's say it's right now, public school's free. Let's say this law gets passed next year and it takes into effect. That family that has 5 kids went from not paying for public school to having to pay $50,000 a year, which is basically out-of-state tuition for your college tuition for, a kid. They're going from not paying anything to basically paying a college tuition for all their kids to go to elementary school. that is a huge financial burden. People, that first year, if they made that mandatory, I believe a lot of people would have to pull out loans just to keep their kids in school. And it's just and then that's going to already add to the crazy amount of student debt that this country already has. And that's just college. Then you're going to have to add all this debt from high school and elementary school. It just doesn't make sense to me to do that, or why you would even want to do that. And I'm going to be honest, I don't see too much of a big benefit between going from private school to public school. Obviously, I'm a little biased because I only went to public school, but I have had friends that have been in both private and public, and I have friends that have been in just private. And I don't see that. I don't think being in a private, obviously the sample size that I have of friends is not a whole representation of, the whole population of this demographic. But I would venture to say that the difference and the advantage you get between private school and public school, I don't think is so much bigger to the point where it would be beneficial to have everybody go to a private school, if that makes sense. I'm sure there's certain like specific trade schools or trade high school, trade private schools where the advantage is big. Like I don't know, for example, if you wanted to get into acting, I'm sure there's some private schools that have specifically geared towards an acting school where they still go over the basic math, whatever, but then they also have these core electives that kind of give you an advantage in that field. I'm sure there's some like that, but the grand scheme, some of the entire population of America, I don't think there's that big of an advantage or a big enough advantage to make $10,000 on top of $11,000. Because for one kid, 5 years, first through second, it's $10K. Let's assume middle school is the same. And middle school is another 6th, 7th, 8th grade. So that's $80,000 between first grade to 8th grade. Then 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th is 11K. 11 times 4, 44,000. So you got 80K plus 44. Hang on, that's $124,000. So one kid is going to, from first grade to graduating high school, it's going to take $124,000 for that one child. That is before they even get into college. And then college, my out-of-state tuition for University of Missouri, luckily I didn't have to pay it, but my out-of-state tuition for University of Missouri was $36,000 a year. Obviously you get to see like what your tuition is, whatever. It's $36,000 a year. So before you get to college, you have $124,000, and then let's just take that number for example and multiply that times 4. We'll just do times 4. That's another $144,000. So you're talking about $268,000 from first grade to graduating college. That is not including grad school. That's a lot of money. That's per child. If you had to pay that per child, a lot of people are probably either not having kids at all or having just one. Because if you take that number, and let's say this arbitrary family we've been talking about, what did I say, 200 and, I forgot what number I said already. Did I say 248,000? I believe I did. Let's multiply that times 5. Between 5 kids, that is $1.2 million it would cost a family to take 5 kids. Now 5 is, obviously an outlier because most families don't have 5. But I'm just saying we've been using 5 as the magic number since I started using the example. But 5 kids from first grade to graduating college with a bachelor's, you're talking $1.2 million. It makes no sense because you're going to mandate. It would make sense if you didn't mandate public school. Like if you said we're gonna make all public schools private, but we're not gonna mandate that they go to school. They can just go to a trade school, or they can just wait till they're 16, go to just work, whatever, or do I don't know, maybe some type of extracurricular, maybe take some I don't know, you see what I'm saying? But let's just say you could wait till they turn 16, then they can start working, and then when they turn 18, go into a trade school. You know what I'm saying? If there was another alternative, then you could also argue homeschool them. Sure, that's fine. But how many people is homeschooling a realistic option? For me, my parents both worked. So I don't think homeschooling would have been an option the way my family is set up. At least the way my family dynamics. So both my parents worked. Both my parents were picking us up, dropping us off at sporting events, because both of them had jobs, full-time jobs. So I feel like a lot of families homeschool, and then you also have to still pay for homeschooling. Homeschooling is not free. It might be cheaper than private school, but it's still paying more money than you would public school. And so I just don't see how it makes sense to mandate that, because if there was an alternative where, okay, they don't have to go to school, but they have to have some type of trade schooling or some type of trade specific skill certificate by the time of 18. That way they have some type of education. Then maybe if you did that, you could probably, that would make a little more sense, because you're not mandating them spending $228,000 to go to public school. There's an alternative option where it's significantly less money. But because you're going to mandate or force that $248,000 burden onto that family, makes no sense. I think that's just outrageous. Now, let me take this time to say that I'm not trying to talk bad on private schools. I believe if you can afford private school and you can get a really good education for private school, that's fantastic. Go for it. If you're a family, you're thinking about putting your kids in private school, if you can afford it, that's beautiful. Do it. I'm just saying it's a problem to make it mandatory to pay for school when the system is already set up for it to be free. That's all I'm saying, because I do understand that it might sound like that I'm just talking bad on private school. I just think it's unfair to make something like that mandatory when private school is so expensive. Now, next point, I don't think let's say we take every high school, we take every elementary school, every middle school, and every high school, and you make them private. That means they don't get funding from the government. All their money comes from people paying tuition. I think the number of total schools from elementary to high school would drop, because I don't think that would be sustainable enough. Some of these schools would be sustainable enough. You have to get these small town schools that don't have many, small town schools maybe have a graduating class of 400. I don't know, see how you can fund a high school with 400 students without making the tuition crazy expensive. If you make it, it's tough. I guess if you charged $1,000 per kid between 400 kids, that's 400,000. That's not bad. But if you're talking a small town, how many of them could afford $1,000 per student per year? It just doesn't make sense. I'm trying to make it make sense in my head, but I don't think that that's a viable option. And I think a lot of schools would either probably have to dissolve or just close down. And I feel like you'd have the schooling zoning would just get bigger. So the schools that have enough students that are able, because the key would be volume. If you were a school that you weren't, let's say you weren't for this law being passed, you were against it, but it got passed because you wanted public education to be free, but it got passed anyway. So obviously that school would probably try to charge the least amount they could to stay a school. The key to that would be volume. Obviously, the more students you have enrolled, the less you have to charge. If you have 5,000 students, a big 6, 7A school, then you don't have to charge so much to make a lot of money. Versus smaller schools would have to charge more to keep the schools running. In terms, maintenance, schools have electricity bills, things we don't think about. Think about all the lights that are in the school. Imagine a light bill that a school facility, a school building probably takes up. It's probably ridiculous. So I feel like those smaller schools would probably have to dissolve, and a lot of these kids that go to smaller schools would have to get transportation or find a way to get to the next closest sustainable school. That's what I think would happen to these small town or smaller schools that probably don't have the student population to survive without being crazy expensive. And again, then you'd have to worry about people dropping out or transferring schools because they couldn't afford to go to that school, things like that. Now, going on to my next point, I think this is probably a really, really big point, is and a point people probably don't even think about. I think this would negatively, like very severely negatively impact low income and underrepresented communities. You talk about low income communities already are low income. And so the fact that their school being public is probably very, very crucial to their education because they're not paying for the school. Now you make that school, like remember, we're talking low income. So under 20,000, maybe $25,000 and under a year's salary, right? I've been there. I've been a salary of $19,000 a year. I know what that's like. I could not imagine having a kid paying for me. Now I'm just talking a single parent, which would be probably a single parent. I couldn't imagine paying for myself, paying for my kid, and paying a tuition for an elementary schooler. I couldn't imagine. I don't have a kid, but I've been by myself on $19,000. It's tough. It's really tough. You got to live like a college student, which I was a college student, but at the time. But you have to live like a college student, which is not very, very well for most college students. At least my experience, I didn't live very. I was living $19,000 a year, and I was living paycheck to paycheck, barely making it by myself. Now you add a child who you still got to feed, you got to bathe, try to give them the best life possible, toys, whatever, food, all of this stuff, and pay for their school. I could not imagine. So you're talking about it would probably be devastating to low income, underrepresented communities that are already barely getting by with the school being public. And I tell you, $19,000 a year, even if they charged $100 a month for tuition or $50 a month, $50 is a lot of money when you're on $19,000 a year. Trust me, it's a ton of money. I could stretch $50 to last me a week. That's how far you can stretch $50 when you really have to. $50 is a lot. So for me, it's a week's worth of food for breakfast, lunch, dinner. It's a week's worth of food if you do it right. So $50 is a lot. So even if they were charging $50, and then that's per kid. Some of these families have 2 or 3 mouths they have to feed. And you're talking, even at $50 a month to go to this private school, that's a lot for these underrepresented communities. So I think that part in on its own, even just that point is enough to where I don't think that would be a good idea to privatize the entire public school system. And then I guess it wouldn't be public school system if it was privatized, but you guys get what I'm saying. Now, my last point is kind of when I was making my notes on this topic, it got me kind of thinking. I don't know how that dynamic would work, but the job market. So you make it a private school. Now that school has to, I'm sure they still have a budget when they're public school, but now that school has to really, really be dialed in on their budget. How much is going to the teachers? How much is going to maintenance and upkeep? How much is going to the custodians? How much is going to supplies? How much is going to, if the high school, parking lot or the sports team? How are you divvying up your money, right? And I'm not 100% sure if the teachers would have positive or negative benefits. I'm sure that at the big time schools, the schools that have a lot of students that probably don't have to pay much, it wouldn't be very expensive. I'm sure those teachers would probably end up getting paid more than what they're getting paid for being public schools. But again, like I was saying, with those smaller schools that probably won't be able to sustain themselves, you're talking about a lot of jobs being lost for teachers that working at schools that couldn't sustain themselves being a private school. So I'm very interested to see how that job market would work. And then just because you privatize the schools, does that mean the education's better or is it worse? Because now you've kind of monopolized the school system. Because at least right now you could homeschool, you could boarding school, which I believe falls under private, but you could homeschool, public school, private school, right? And then there's different levels within public schools, especially public schools for sure, because I know the education in Windsor County is going to be different than the education in Dixon County. If you're from Nashville, you know what I'm talking about. Or the education in Murray County is going to be different from the education in the Metro County area. So there's different levels in that. And in private schools, generally speaking, private schools are deemed or seen to have better education systems than public schools. And then how is the homeschool market get affected? Because I believe the homeschool market will get bigger, but just because you have this influx of students, is the quality of the education the same? That, I believe, is the most important thing, where if you're going to make a law like this, does it make your education system better? I'd almost argue that it doesn't make it better, because anytime you monopolize something like a public service, it usually doesn't get better because there's no competition anymore, right? So you can have these piss poor teachers teaching in these positions, making all this money, but they're not good teachers. You see what I'm saying? At least in public school systems, if you have a bad teacher, at least from my experience, if you have a bad teacher, they don't stick around very long. In my experiences, Winston County, at least back when I was in high school, they had a pretty good job of figuring out if there was a bad teacher or teacher that just wasn't very good, they didn't stay at that school very long. So that's just me kind of pondering how that would work. I think it would probably have a negative effect on the quality of education. Because now, do you think about public schools? Let's say it's go public school or private schools, homeschool, this hierarchy of the highest education is private school. I'm just talking high school for right now. Then in the middle you have public schools, and at the bottom you have homeschool. Let's just assume it's like that, right? I don't know the statistics for real. If you bring these two up into private, now you have this giant oversaturation of schools and private schools. And so, I don't know. This is just me trying to make it make sense, because now you kind of dilute the prestige of private schools by adding these public schools into it, if we're keeping the hierarchy. I'm not saying private schools is more prestige or it's better. I'm just saying if we're going to give it that stigma, you dilute it by adding public schools, right? And then I'm also thinking of, okay, let's just say you have a school that's been a school for 50 years, and then you just make it private. Let's say it sustains itself. You still have the same teachers, the same management, it's the same school. So does the education get better? You could argue over time it gets better, because if it makes more money, it can start paying its teachers better, or it can start getting better talent. You can make that argument down the road, but just because a school makes more money doesn't inherently mean that it's going to be a better education system or a better educated school. You see what I'm saying? So I don't know. That was just me answering the question. I don't think all schools should be private schools. I kind of like in terms of the structure of public schools being free, private schools being private, I do think that that's a good structure to have. I don't agree with the curriculum. That's a whole different podcast for another day. But I do think having the option of, if you want to go to private school, you can go to private school, no problem. You don't have to be zoned for that school. You can drive an hour to that school if you want to every day, if that's what you really want to do. Public schools, you have to be zoned for that school. So it's all about location. Then you got to try to make sure you move to where your house is zoned for the school. So there's pros and cons to each, but you have an option. If you want to go to a private school, you can. If not, you just go to a public school you're zoned for. If you don't like that, if you have the ability to move, you can move. You have options. I like the ability to have options. I think options is always a good way. Obviously, we all know that monopolizing just anything is not really good, because you lose competition and you lose the ability to have options. And options is always good. If you want to homeschool. If you think your kid can get better education by being homeschooled and learning from you, as well as however it's set up, then if you have the ability to do that, then I think that's really, truly at the fundamental of it all. That's the true American dream, is having the freedom to do whichever one you want. You want private, public, or homeschool, you can. So this is going to be it for this week's Uncle Strib. I hope you guys learned something or like it or take something away. If not, we'll see you guys next week. And your boy out.
I'm gonna chase my dreams. My life has